I am 83 years old, and my name is Cecily Marrow. Last Thanksgiving, I stood in my dining room looking at a table set perfectly for 8 people, but there were only 2 chairs actually filled. It was just me and my sister Jean, who had driven 4 long hours, mostly because she pitied me. Earlier that day, my daughter Susan had called right around noon to tell me that traffic was just too bad to make the trip, and my son Michael didn't even bother to call. He just sent me a text message with a little turkey emoji. I remember watching the mashed potatoes go completely cold while I sat there, pretending not to check my phone for more messages. Jean gently reached over, touched my hand, and told me that they were just busy and that they loved me. I smiled and nodded because that is exactly what you do when someone you love is desperately trying to save you from a very humiliating truth. But what I didn't say out loud to her was that I had spent 3 entire days in that kitchen, cooking food that absolutely no one had asked for, simply because I thought that if I made everything perfect enough, they would finally want to come home. Later that night, as I stood at the sink scraping whole, untouched sweet potato casseroles straight into the trash can, the house was so dreadfully quiet that I could actually hear the low hum of the refrigerator. I looked down at my hands and thought, when exactly did I become someone that my own children try to avoid? If you are watching this right now, and you know exactly what that heavy, cold silence feels like, please know that you are not invisible and you are not alone. Sighs. Before I tell you the uncomfortable truth about the rather cruel trick I used to completely change my relationship with my children, I want to ask you to please take a quick second to subscribe to this channel. We talk about the real, raw, and sometimes painful parts of getting older here, and I would absolutely love for you to stay and be part of our community. I raised 5 children in this house, 5 distinct personalities, 5 sets of problems, 5 lives that I poured my entire soul into. I showed up to every single school event that mattered, and honestly, most of the ones that didn't matter at all. I stood at the kitchen counter and packed lunch boxes every morning for 18 years straight. When they were teenagers and even young adults, I was the one answering those terrifying middle-of-the-night phone calls when they were reckless or in trouble and just needed someone who would help them without asking too many questions. For decades, I honestly thought we were close, or at least close enough. But somewhere in that wide, blurry space between their childhoods and my old age, I slowly transitioned from being an essential part of their universe to becoming completely optional. Sighs. I became a chore on their to-do list, a name heavily attached to guilt, a voice on the other end of the phone that they answered with a heavy sigh. I didn't know how it happened. I just knew that it had. At first I made excuses for them, telling myself it was only temporary. I told myself they had demanding jobs, young kids, heavy mortgages, and complicated lives. I tried to be the understanding mother, reminding myself that I wasn't one of those needy women who demanded daily phone calls. I just desperately wanted something, anything, that felt like I still mattered in the actual shape of their daily lives. For the better part of a decade, I did exactly what every parenting book, every well-meaning neighbor, and every magazine article sitting in a doctor's waiting room told older mothers to do. I was told to keep reaching out, to show up, to remain available, to be easygoing, and to just be intensely grateful for whatever tiny scraps of time they decided to throw my way. Sighs. I am going to share something with you today that might sound harsh, but it desperately needs to be said out loud by a woman who actually lived through it. There is a specific approach, a trick, if you will, that might sound almost cruel when you first hear it, but it is exactly the thing that brought my children back to me. Pause it. Repaired our broken dynamic and made them actually want to visit me completely on their own, without me ever having to ask or beg. If it worked for my family, I truly believe it can work for yours. In the beginning of this lonely season, I played by society's rules, and I tried far too hard. I started calling them more often, dialing their numbers on Sunday afternoons or Tuesday evenings, whenever I felt it wouldn't be too much of a bother. I would brightly ask how they were doing, and they would give me the standard fine. I would ask about my grandchildren, and they would just read me the quick headlines of their lives. School is good, soccer is fine, everyone is fine. Our conversations felt less like a relationship and more like they were simply checking a required box on a chore chart. I kept trying to convince myself that this was simply what adult family relationships looked like: practical, distanced, and efficient. But the truth was, it wasn't enough, and pretending that it was fine was starting to hurt me far more than just admitting the painful truth. Most of the time, the calls I made went straight to voicemail. When they actually did pick up the phone, I could clearly hear them multitasking in the background. I could hear the clatter of dishes being washed, the hum of traffic, the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard. It made me feel like I was just a minor distraction they were trying to squeeze in between their real errands. I started intentionally keeping my conversations incredibly short, just so they wouldn't have to look for an excuse to hang up on me. I would place the receiver back on the cradle, feeling so much smaller and more insignificant than I had before I dialed their number. When the phone calls didn't bridge the gap, I decided to try being relentlessly useful. I started sending out overly generous birthday cards with large checks tucked inside. I would go to the store, see a little toy truck, a picture book, or some pretty hair ribbons, and I would carefully package them up and mail them to the grandkids. My heart would race just imagining them opening the package, thinking that maybe they would think of me for just 1 second, maybe smile, or maybe mention it the next time we spoke. Sighs. But the thank you calls came days late, or sometimes they never came at all. I used to sit in my living room and genuinely wonder if the Postal Service had lost the packages, or if they were just sitting entirely unopened in a dusty pile by their front doors. Exhales. I even tried offering my services as a babysitter. I called my daughter Patty and offered to take the kids for a weekend, and she laughed politely and said, "Oh, Mom, that's sweet, but you really don't need to do that." She said it in this tone that made it sound like I was volunteering out of sad duty rather than deep desperation, like the very idea of me spending a single afternoon with my own flesh and blood was some sort of exhausting charity work I had taken on. The lowest point, the moment that truly cracked my heart wide open, happened on a random Saturday when I decided to drive over an hour to my son David's house. I had spent the entire morning in the kitchen making a massive, complicated lasagna completely from scratch. I carefully wrapped the heavy glass dish in thick towels to keep it piping hot for the long drive. When I got close to his neighborhood, I called him and casually lied, saying I just happened to be in the area, even though the only reason I was in that zip code was to see his face. When I finally pulled into his driveway and walked up his steps, he opened the front door, immediately reached out and took the hot dish from my hands, thanked me very quickly, and then bluntly announced that they were just about to head out the door for the day. I stood there on his concrete porch for exactly 90 seconds. He gave me the kind of stiff, polite, distant hug that you give an old acquaintance at a funeral. I turned around, got back into my car, and I cried so hard the entire hour-long drive back to my empty house, feeling so unbelievably pathetic for trying to buy my own son's affection with pasta and cheese. Despite all the pain, I still refused to stop trying. I planned a grand family dinner at my house, giving everyone 3 full weeks of notice so they couldn't use their schedules as an excuse. I promised I would do absolutely all of the cooking, telling them they just needed to show up. Susan gave me a vague maybe, Michael promised he would try, and Linda said she already had plans but would let me know if things changed. When the day finally arrived, I spent hours cooking a beautiful roast. I set the dining room table perfectly, bringing out the good cloth napkins that I usually saved for holidays. I sat down in the quiet house and I waited. Sighs. At 5 o'clock, Susan called to say her son suddenly had a conflict. Michael never bothered to call at all. Disappointed, Linda finally showed up an hour late, stayed for exactly 20 minutes, and spent almost the entire time staring down at her glowing phone screen. I ended up packaging all the uneaten food into plastic containers and sending her home with leftovers that she clearly didn't even want. Later that night, as I stood at the sink washing the good dishes completely alone, I asked myself why I continued to actively participate in my own heartbreak. The most devastating realization wasn't that they failed to show up. It was the chilling fact that they didn't even feel guilty about it. I realized then that I had been working so incredibly hard to maintain my presence in their busy lives that I had accidentally made myself completely invisible. I had become the emotional background noise of their existence. I was the dependable mother who always made the first call, who always put in the effort, who always forgave their absence, and who was always just sitting there waiting. They never actually had to spend a single moment thinking about me, simply because I never gave them the opportunity to miss me. I did all the heavy lifting, all the reminding, and in doing so I had trained my own children to take me completely for granted. And then I spent my nights silently resenting them for learning the exact lesson I had taught them. I know this is going to sound incredibly silly, but my perspective began to shift over something as trivial as a sandwich. One afternoon, I made myself a simple turkey and lettuce sandwich for lunch. I sat down at my quiet kitchen table, took a bite, and a sudden, intense wave of anger washed over me. I sat there and realized that I had eaten thousands of meals completely by myself in this silent house, and not a single one of my 5 children actually knew that. In their minds, they thought I was perfectly fine. They assumed I was busy, that I had a vibrant, full life that they just weren't a part of. I finally admitted to myself that I had allowed them to believe that convenient lie, because admitting how profoundly lonely I was felt exactly like admitting that I was a massive failure as a mother. Everything truly began to change because of a little girl who wasn't even related to me. My neighbor, Sarah, lived 2 doors down, and she had an 8-year-old daughter named Emma. Because I was trying to find ways to alleviate my crushing loneliness, I had offered to start walking Emma home from the school bus stop a few days a week. One crisp afternoon, we stopped at the corner, waiting to cross the street, just like we always did. Emma was animatedly telling me a rambling story about a drawing she had made in art class, something about a purple dinosaur. Right in the middle of her sentence, without hesitating or looking for permission, she casually reached up and grabbed my hand. We walked the entire rest of the way to her house just like that, her tiny, warm hand wrapped securely inside mine. There was no special occasion, no feeling of forced obligation. She held my hand simply because she wanted to be near me. Looking down at her, a profound realization hit me like a physical blow. This sweet child wasn't visiting with me because she felt guilty. She wasn't resentfully squeezing me into a packed schedule. She was 8 years old, and she actively chose my company because I never demanded it from her. I just showed up, consistently and quietly, without ever keeping a miserable emotional scorecard. I never guilt-tripped her. I never acted like I desperately needed her, and I never made an 8-year-old child responsible for curing my loneliness. I was just simply present, and that peaceful presence made her actually want to stay. Because of that connection, her mother Sarah started stopping by my house more frequently. She didn't come over because I called her begging for company, or because I dropped heavy-handed hints about being alone. She would just knock on my front door and ask if I needed anything from the grocery store, or she would ask if I wanted some company while she mindlessly folded her laundry. Sometimes she would ask if Emma could sit at my kitchen table for an hour while she ran a few quick errands. They were all such small, incredibly ordinary interactions, but they felt so incredibly real. Sighs. The best part was that I never felt the exhausting need to put on a performance for them. I didn't have to spend 3 days cooking a massive feast, and I didn't have to plaster on a fake smile and pretend that my life was perfect. I could just be exactly who I was in that moment, sometimes tired, sometimes quiet, occasionally grumpy, and they stayed anyway. They didn't show up at my door because I had somehow earned their time through a transaction of lasagna and birthday checks. They showed up because there was an open, completely pressure-free space for them in my home. Because I wasn't aggressively trying to fill every single silence with my own desperate need for validation, a beautiful stillness settled over my house. And in that stillness, something entirely new began to grow. It wasn't built on heavy obligation or inherited guilt, but on genuine presence, which is the one thing in this world you absolutely cannot force. That is when I finally decided to execute the cruel trick. I did the exact opposite of what every single person tells an aging mother to do. I completely stopped calling my children. I didn't do it out of fiery anger. I wasn't trying to maliciously punish them, and it certainly wasn't born out of cruelty. I did it because I simply could not survive another day of pretending that the effort in our relationship was mutual. I physically and emotionally could not continue begging for a type of attention that was never going to be given to me freely. The rejection was quite literally breaking my heart, so I just stopped. I aggressively stopped texting them first. I completely stopped making my routine Sunday afternoon phone calls. I stopped buying greeting cards. I stopped mailing carefully wrapped gifts. And I stopped sending out dinner invitations that I knew were just going to end up nowhere. I placed my telephone on the side table, and I simply let it sit there in total silence. I looked at my calendar, and I allowed the squares to remain completely empty. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and I waited to see exactly what would happen to my family if I wasn't the one desperately holding the entire thread together. The beginning of this experiment was sheer agony. For the first few weeks, absolutely nothing happened. Days bled into weeks, and nobody seemed to notice my absence at all. Or, if they did notice that I had suddenly gone quiet, they certainly didn't care enough to say anything about it. Those silent weeks violently confirmed my deepest, darkest fear. That I had been doing 100% of the heavy lifting in these relationships, and without my constant effort, there was absolutely nothing left holding us together. Sighs. I would sit in my dim living room late at night, aggressively staring at the black screen of my cell phone, silently willing it to light up and ring. It never did. The silence in my house became so physically heavy that there were nights I genuinely felt like I was drowning in it. Exhale sharply. The temptation to cave in was overwhelming. I constantly thought that maybe I had made a terrible mistake, and that maybe I should just swallow my pride and go back to calling them. My mind tried to trick me, whispering that at least if I called them, I would get to hear their voices, even if they were annoyed and distracted. At least then, I would maintain the fragile illusion that I was still a part of something bigger than myself. But I dug my heels in, and I didn't dial. I held perfectly still. I forced myself to sit in the painful absence and just let it exist. And then, right around the 6-week mark of absolute silence, my phone finally rang. It was a random Tuesday afternoon, and Linda's name flashed on the screen. I answered calmly, and she immediately said, "Mom, I haven't heard from you in a while. Are you okay?" I kept my voice steady and simply told her that I was perfectly fine. There was a long, unprompted pause on her end of the line, and then she quietly asked, "Can I come by this weekend? I really want to see you." I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't lay on a thick guilt trip about the last 6 weeks. I just calmly said yes. When Saturday arrived, she came over and she ended up staying for 3 solid hours. We didn't spend a single second talking about why I had suddenly gone radio silent, because we didn't have to. She looked at me completely differently that afternoon, almost as if she was truly seeing me for the very first time in years. For the first time in a decade, she was looking at me like I was an actual human being with my own sovereign life, rather than just an endless, demanding position she had to manage. That one visit was the domino that tipped the rest. Exactly 1 week later, Michael sent me a text message out of the blue, asking if it would be all right if he brought the grandchildren over for a bit. A few days after that, Susan called and cheerfully asked if she could take me out to lunch. Even David, the son who had essentially pushed me off his porch in 90 seconds, showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning and started fixing my wobbly porch railing without me ever having to ask him for help. Slowly but surely, they started showing up again. It wasn't all the time, and it certainly wasn't a flawless fairy tale, but it was drastically more consistent than it had been in years. But the most vital change wasn't the frequency of their visits, it was the entire energy behind them. When they walked through my front door now, the air felt different. It felt so much lighter. They were showing up because they actively wanted to be in my home, not because an invisible societal clock told them they owed me an hour of their time. This organic, unforced connection continues happening to this very day. They just come on their own schedule now, and I let them. The truth of the matter is that I didn't actually do anything cruel to my children. I didn't trap them, and I didn't manipulate them. I simply stopped taking a giant pair of scissors to my own dignity. I stopped shrinking myself down and making myself impossibly small just so I could conveniently fit into the tiny leftover corners of their busy lives. I stopped profusely apologizing for simply existing and taking up space in the world. I stopped accepting their emotional crumbs and pretending that a 90-second hug was a satisfying meal. When I finally stopped obsessively performing the exhausting role of the martyr mother who required absolutely nothing and constantly gave everything, they finally, for the first time in their adult lives, had the actual physical and emotional room to miss me. But here is the most beautiful, unexpected part of this entire journey. I actually started to feel significantly less lonely weeks before they ever even picked up the phone to call me, because I had finally stopped spending all of my waking hours waiting for my children to swoop in and fix my life. I was forced to build a life that didn't require their constant presence for me to feel whole. I cherished my quiet afternoon walks with little Emma. I genuinely looked forward to sitting in Sarah's kitchen, drinking her undeniably terrible coffee, and listening to her talk about complex daily problems that I couldn't possibly solve, but that I could offer a sympathetic ear to. I reclaimed my quiet evening hours, claiming them as a time that belonged strictly to me. I had towering stacks of wonderful books to read. I had beautiful birds to watch out my window, and I had my own peaceful thoughts for company. The greatest gift I gave myself was that I completely stopped measuring my own internal worth by tallying up how often my adult children called my cell phone. That profound internal shift, more than any silent treatment I gave them, is what ultimately transformed me back into a grounded, peaceful person that they actually wanted to be around again. Today, some of my children are incredibly close to me. Some of them still prefer to keep a bit of a comfortable distance. And the most empowering part is that I have made absolute, unwavering peace with that reality. I am no longer desperately trying to collect their visits like shiny trophies to prove that I was a good mother. I am no longer exhausting myself trying to prove to the world that I still matter. I simply am. The children who clearly see my value and who actively want to be a part of my peaceful life, they show up. As for the rest of them, I have learned to love them warmly from a safe distance. It really is enough. I am 83 years old, and I have spent over 5 decades of my life being completely defined as someone's mother, and I am fiercely proud of everything I did for them. But in the frantic rush of raising them, I had entirely forgotten that I was also just Cecily. I am a grown woman who has the absolute right to take up space, who has her own distinct preferences, and who absolutely does not owe any living soul her own smallness. I know deep in my bones that my children love me. But the hardest lesson of aging is realizing that love is not always the exact same thing as attention, and scattered attention is certainly not the same thing as true, grounded presence. For far too many years, I tragically confused all three of those things. What I know for absolute certain now is this: you cannot forcefully make another human being want to spend time with you. But what you absolutely can do out of a deep and unwavering sense of self-respect is stop making it so incredibly easy for them to ignore you. This isn't born out of spite or cruelty, it is born out of survival, because the harsh truth is that the people who truly deeply love you will always notice when you suddenly go quiet. They will feel the sudden vacuum of your absence, and they will start to wonder why you aren't reaching out anymore. And if you are lucky, and if you have raised them right, they will eventually come looking for you. Not because you guilted them into it, not because you begged them, but because they finally had the space to realize exactly how cold the world feels when your warmth isn't there to comfort them. I am infinitely grateful that I found the strength to put the phone down and stop calling them. Not simply because the trick ended up working, but because the agonizing process of waiting taught me that I was actually strong enough to survive, even if it didn't. I am still standing here. I am still entirely whole, and I am absolutely a woman worth visiting, regardless of whether they ever walk through that front door or not. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me today and listen to an old woman's story. If anything I've said today resonated with your heart, or if you have experienced this exact same painful shift with your own family, I would be so incredibly grateful if you would scroll down and leave me a comment sharing your experience. I read every single one of them, and your stories make me feel so much less alone in this world. Please consider sharing this video with a friend or a family member who might be silently struggling with this exact same heavy burden, because nobody should have to carry this kind of loneliness in the dark. I plan on being right here for a long time, still figuring this life out, so please subscribe and I will see you in the next one. Until then, please take beautiful care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you today.